Good morning, everybody. Good morning, good morning. We are so glad to see everyone here. It's so good to be here together this morning at 1111 downtown. Last week we were packed in this room. I can assume that the Cowboy game starts today. I haven't looked, but I'm assuming there's a 12 o'clock start. And then add that to the fun chill out there. So I'm glad that you all are here. We'll try to get you out in time to catch the fourth quarter. Thank you. Real quick, I want to make a couple announcements. We have some great music today, and I want to get right into our service. But just really quick, if you look on the back of your bulletin, first of all, it's so good to have you here. And if you're visiting for the first time, especially glad to have you all here. And I hope you'll fill out the card that you have there in your chair, or scan it on your phone and fill it out online, and then turn those in a moment. We'll do our offering and our cards up here during our first song together. So please do fill that out. And then several of you have actually checked off one to get pie. So this week I'm catching up on pie. So if you're in, I know some of you have been waiting for weeks. Okay. So real quick, if you'll turn over the bulletin. Listen, at 12:30 today, if the game's not a big issue to you and you got some time, this would be good to go do this. Over in the main sanctuary, in Wesley Hall in the main building, we'll be meeting. The church will have a church-wide meeting for this campaign that we're calling the Next 90. We are in this room because our space is limited in the main building, and there are multiple services using all the spaces, and so we opted to come to this space and see how this worked out. We're not intending to stay here in particular indefinitely. Our hope is eventually to move back into a remodeled and larger facility. The church is about to engage in a building program if the church votes as a whole to do that. And so this Next 90 is called 90 because the First Methodist Church, we have been here for 90 years. We broke ground on the stock market crash day of 1929, we broke ground on the day the market crashed. And we'll be celebrating our 90th anniversary this year, so in 2018, or next year, 2019. Is that right? Yes, thank you. So we have the Next 90. We're thinking about the Next 90. What does First Methodist, what does this unique church with its diverse culture and diverse worship styles and its powerful ministry into the city, what does this church represent for the Next 90? And so they've got a little video, and they're going to answer some questions. I hope you'll take some time and go over there and be a part of that in Wesley Hall. We are still also marketing for the advertising for the Ireland trip. We have about 18, 19 people right now. We're hoping to get about 25 or so, and I think we'll make it. So take a look at that. Let me know if you haven't let me know already. All right? That's it for now. Let's begin with our candle, our welcome candle.
The candle is lit. Please join me in our welcome. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving. It doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vows 1,000 times. Come yet again.
When the days are cold and the cards are full and the saints we see are all made of gold, when your dreams are failing, the ones we hail are the worst of all, and the blood runs stale. I wanna hide the truth, I want to shelter you, but with the beast inside, there's nowhere we can hide. No matter what we bring, we still are made of greed. This is my kingdom come, this is my kingdom come. When you feel my heat, look into my eyes. It's where my demons hide, it's where my demons hide. Don't get too close, it's up inside. It's where my demons hide, it's where my demons hide. Curtains call, it's the last of all. When the lights fade out, all the sinners crawl, so they dug mess you made. Don't wanna let you down, but I am hellbound. Oh, this is all for you. Don't wanna hide the truth. No matter what we breed, we still are made of greed. This is my kingdom come. This is my kingdom come. Can you feel my heat? Look into my eyes. It's where my demons hide. It's where my demons hide. Don't get too close. It's dark inside. It's where my demons hide. It's where my demons hide. They say it's what you make. I say it's up to fate. It's woven in my soul. I need to let you go. Your eyes, they shine so bright. I wanna save that light. I can't escape this now unless you show me how. Look into my eyes. It's where my demons hide. It's where my demons hide. Don't get too close. It's dark inside. It's where my demons hide. It's where my demons hide.
As we focus on this theme of today, sometimes as we begin a service like this, we come into the room with so many things upon our hearts and minds. And so in this week in which we are moving into the holiday season and this time of Thanksgiving and gratitude, sometimes it is in the most unexpected places, and sometimes it is through the most unexpected people and experiences that we find and experience the holy. And so maybe we open our mind and heart to that. Let us pray. O Holy One, in the midst of chaos, uncertainty, in the midst of things that make us uncomfortable, and people who make us uncomfortable, open our minds and hearts so that we might look into one another's eyes and see beyond the surface, listen beyond what is spoken, and be present in the midst of the beauty, but also in the midst of the mess. Come and be present with us now, we pray. Amen.
Thank you, DeAndrea. I'd like to invite you folks to stand now and sing with us, would you please? We got words on the screen and words in the bulletin. Hey, and don't forget, this is a great time to bring your offering to the table as well. All right. Verse 1, here we go together. You may be watching from a safe distance. So close you can taste the blood. You may have headed for higher ground. You may be drowning in the flood. Here we go, yeah. No matter what you do, love will find you, yeah. Verse 2 all together. You may have lost what little faith you had. You may believe there's only one. You may be pulling yourself together again. You may be falling apart. All right, no matter what you do. right. Come on up here with me, dude.
Okay, so as part of our series this morning, here's what I want you to do. We did this once before, and somebody actually emailed me and said this was the most powerful, moving thing they had done in such a long time. So here's what I want you to do. Instead of just saying welcome to one another, I want you to say, it's good to be here. I'm here because of you. If you'll do that with one another.
All right. We're going to slide into our Kairos time now with a song. Claire's going to lead it. I hope y'all sing along with us. It's like this.
As the music at the banquet, as the wine before the meal, as the firelight in the night, so are you to me.
Join us, would you?
As a ruby in the setting, as the fruit upon the tree, as the wind blows over the plains, so are you to me.
Let's sing some more.
As the wind blows over the plains, so are you to me. So are you to me.
As we move into this Kairos time, this is the time that is between all that has happened and all that is to be. And so it is our present time in which we focus now. And so close your eyes, just sit. If you aren't comfortable closing your eyes, leave them open. But let us focus and be silent. And in the midst of the silence, May we think of these things. In the midst of, you fill in the blank, I am thankful for. In the midst of, I am thankful for. May we spend just a few moments offering our thoughts together as a community. In this moment, which is all that we have right now, we offer our space, our heart, our dreams, our questions to you and to one another. May we find gratefulness in this moment, for this moment is a gift. Amen.
Good morning. This morning, our scripture reading comes from Mark chapter 4, verses 3 through 5, and then chapter 5, verses 1 through 20. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And they came to the other side of the lake, to the region of the Gerasenes. As soon as Jesus got out of the boat, a man possessed by an evil spirit came out of the tombs. This man had been secured many times with leg irons and chains, but he broke the chains, and no one was tough enough to control him. Night and day in the tombs and the hills, he would howl and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus, he ran and knelt before him, shouting, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" And Jesus asked him, "What's your name?" And he responded, "Legion is my name, because we are many." They pleaded with Jesus not to send them out of that region. Now a large herd of pigs was feeding on the hillside, so the demons begged Jesus, "Let us go into the pigs." Jesus gave them permission, so the unclean spirits left the man and went into the pigs. Then the herd of about 2,000 pigs rushed down the cliff into the lake and drowned. Those who tended the pigs ran away and told the story in the city and in the countryside. People came to Jesus and saw the man who used to be demon-possessed sitting there fully dressed and completely sane. And they were filled with fear. Those who had actually seen what had happened to the demon-possessed man told the others about the pigs. Then they pleaded with Jesus to leave their region. While he was climbing into the boat, the one who had been demon-possessed begged Jesus to let him follow as one of his disciples. But Jesus said, "No, go home to your own people and tell them what the Lord has done for you and shown you mercy." The man went away and began to proclaim in all the Decapolis all that Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed.
Live in the world, not inside my head. Wanna live in the world, I want to stand and be counted with the hopeful and the willing, with the open and the strong, with the voices in the darkness, fashioning daylight out of song, and the millions of lovers alive in the world. I want to live in the world, not behind some wall. I want to live in the world where I will hear if another voice should call to the prisoner inside me, to the captive of my doubt, who among his fantasies harbors a dream of breaking out and taking his chances alive in the world. To open my eyes and wake up alive in the world. To open my eyes and finally arrive in the world. With its beauty and its cruelty, with its heartbreak and its joy, with it constantly giving birth to forces in life it tries to destroy, and the infinite power of change alive in the world. To open my eyes and wake up alive in the world. To open my eyes and finally arrive in the world. To open my eyes and wake up alive in the world. To open my eyes and finally arrive in the world.
Wow. So you kind of get the idea, right? We start off with Imagine Dragons, and we're trying to deal with the demons, and then we hear the story of the Gerasene demoniac, and then we just have this song. We want to be alive in the world. What does it mean to be alive in the world? What is it that keeps us? What is it that possesses us, perhaps? What challenges us to find that aliveness in the world? So we're in part 3 of Jesus H. Christ, the man, the history, the mystery, and we're looking at this idea of how we get hung up, where we get hung up. In religion, in religiosity, in faith, in spirituality, in our world with rights and wrongs, and where, in fact, those things aren't so much rights and wrongs as invitations into something bigger. The story is bigger than those things, right? The Rumi text, it's the Middle Eastern mystic Rumi who says, out beyond ideas, there's a field. Out beyond ideas of right and wrong, there's a field. That's where I'll meet you there. Even when we start talking about things like each other, even those words are too much to talk about, right? I am here because of you. You are here because of me. There's a bigger story that we're a part of. So we're in part 3. Part 1, I'm going to go back over it because I know all of you have been here every Sunday since this thing began. But just in case you haven't, I'm going to remind those of you that weren't here for the first part or two, that on the first one we dealt with healing of the blind man, the healing of the man who was blind. And there was this whole idea, it was on the Sabbath. It was a blasphemous act for Jesus to do in the first place. But what Jesus H. Christ is all about is about sort of, again, heading these kinds of rights and wrongs head on with a bigger story, with a bigger picture. And so he heals the blind man on the Sabbath. And we talked about the idea that good traditions move us beyond their boundaries, right? Good traditions move us beyond themselves. When we stay so tied into a tradition or so tied into a belief or into some concept or right or wrong, we become frozen, we become static, we become divisive, we invite polarity. But there's this idea that good traditions move us beyond themselves. And then we concluded with this idea that what does that H stand for anyway? Well, if you think of how the vulgarity, we think of it as a vulgarity and we just won't go there, but maybe in fact, what's always behind these issuances of anger and frustration but a cry for help? And what's the response of the story that's much larger than rights and wrongs, but help is always here? So that was part 1. Part 2, Martha and Mary sitting at the foot of the rabbi. We talked about the school of the rabbinic school and Jesus, and she was actually training with Jesus this idea, and Martha in the kitchen. It wasn't a domestic violence kind of thing. It wasn't a domestic dispute kind of thing. It was recognizing where we are sometimes and getting so hung up with that, getting so overwhelmed with the anxieties around where we are, or if we're doing the right thing, that we forget to do the right thing. Right? We forget to be present to where we are. And sometimes that's actually the challenge. The blasphemy is right there, is actually challenging those roles to be more present to who we are and to who our culture needs us to be in terms of this bigger narrative of redemption. So that's where we were, and here's where we are today. We're talking about demon possession. And the question that I want to kind of play around with you at the end is, maybe Jesus is saying, don't follow me. So we'll just hang on to that. Some of you read the blog. I'm going to go ahead and tell this story anyway because it's important to the whole message here. So this guy was getting on a train, and the conductor was coming along down the aisle to collect the tickets, right? So he's on the train, and the conductor gets to him, and suddenly this guy, he's panicked. He's feeling in his pant pocket. He looks in his wallet. The ticket's not there. He starts to reach in his coat pocket. It's not there. So he goes over to his briefcase, and he starts searching through the briefcase, and it's not there. And the conductor says, did you get it? Of course I got a ticket. I got a ticket. I know I have a ticket. He's looking through everything. He turns to the seatmate next to him, who he doesn't know at all, but he starts looking through his briefcase just in case. So he's looking for his ticket everywhere. And then the conductor says, sir, excuse me, sir, I see you have a vest. Most men, at least as I know, most men will keep their ticket in their vest pocket. Have you looked there? And the guy looks in a panic and he says, oh, no. I'm not going to look there. What if it's not there? I've lost all hope. I'll let that sit with you for a minute. Because I haven't figured out yet why that's so funny, but everybody always laughs at that. So the other day I was listening to an On Being podcast with Krista Tippett, and she said this. She said, there is this great puzzle about life that things can go wrong. Perfection can be a goal, that life goes the way we would want it to go or that we would expect it to go, but then it's never ultimately the destination, and we never ultimately end up there the way we thought we would. And this gives rise across history to this whole debate about theodicy, she says, this whole debate of evil, the place of evil in our reality, the place of disappointment in our reality, the place of suffering and pain. How could there be a good God, or for that matter, how could the balance of the universe be good when there's so much that seems to go wrong? And then she adds this, which I think is the crux of our story, and I want to come back to her. I want you to think about throughout. She says, then there is this paradox in our lives, that if we live wisely enough, we are so often made by the very thing that would break us. There is this paradox in our lives that if we live wisely enough, we are so often made by what would break us. This is where, she says, this is where the spiritual life is so redemptive and necessary, because this is the place in life that honors the fact that there is darkness, but also says you can somehow find meaning right here in the midst of the darkness. Not by overcoming it, not in spite of it, not by moving beyond or around it, by simply seeing it right there in the midst of that challenge. So from my thinking, what goes wrong with us sometimes in life, does it define us? Does it have to define us? And this is where the wisdom is saying to us that people who walk through whatever despair, darkness, divisiveness, hardships, or whatever imperfections, the catastrophists, is that a word, the catastrophists? I wrote, it's a neat word, right? I invent words in here. That whatever, the catastrophists and the ordinary losses of life, that when we walk through these, we are somehow, if we find the way to do it, we are somehow given the opportunity. This is the redemption in the blasphemous. And I want you to hang on to this idea. I want you to take it with you when you leave here and go, what the heck is he talking about? And I want you to keep thinking about this. This is the redemption available in the blasphemous. This idea that somehow we can walk through the catastrophes. We can walk through the ordinary losses and challenges. And when we enter into them, we find at the core, we find at what Paul calls the very ground of our being, God, the sacredness, the holiness, the incarnate of God in the world, however you want to name that. But we find there the possible redemption of all that we're dealing with. Those moments become redeeming moments. The person we're having a conflict right there in front of us, when we enter into that, not with this sense of right or wrong, but with this sense of what do I not know, with this sense of humility, with this sense of openness, suddenly that conflict becomes redemptive. That's the presence of God in the world, I think. That's what's going on in this story, I think. So this is a big question I want to ask you today. What is blasphemy? Okay, we've been kind of playing around with that this whole time in this Jesus H. Christ series. But what I want you to think about is the discomforts that challenge our sense of stability and comfort, the thing we don't want to deal with, so we'll reject or defend against it, or challenge its claims of truth, or claim it as fault, or build walls around it, or circle our wagons to deal with the fears and the anxieties. Here's what I want us to think about. Does our grief and our fear or our doubt define who we are? Or have we found wisdom, a path enough to be able to integrate that into a bigger, larger story of redemption? That's what I think Jesus H. Christ is doing in this story today. He's challenging the despair and the doubt and redefining it. So let me go back to this story because it's really interesting. There's some interesting stuff that I've been researching and learned about this story of the demoniac, right? We think of it simply as just kind of a healing story. This is an amazing little story. Jesus is supernatural. He's got all these magical powers that he can sort of heal people and change lives like that. And here's a demoniac and he exorcises the demon. But there's so much more in this story that we miss because we're 1,970 years past its writing, right? And so we read it as something completely different than how the original hearers of Mark's gospel heard it. Jesus has been teaching on the west side of Galilee, Jerusalem, Galilee, all of the familiar Judeo-Orthodox reality that the disciples and Jesus grew up in. And they've been teaching, and they're out on a boat, and they're sitting out just away from the shore. And then Jesus says, and things have been going good. If you read the stories up to that point, you'd realize there's been some healings, there's been some revelational moments, some challenging, blasphemous moments where Jesus challenges the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and such by doing things like on the Sabbath. All that's happening according to plan. And then Jesus looks at his disciples and says, let's go to the other side of the lake, to the region of the Gerasene. To Gerasa. Now, what we don't know as readers, perhaps, but what they immediately knew is two things. First of all, Mark's gospel is written 50, 60 years, 40, 50 years after Jesus dies, right? So a whole lot of things have already happened. We're already talking 70, 80 A.D. That region, for one thing, that region was established by Alexander the Great. On the east side of the Sea of Galilee, which was basically like a very large lake, on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, the whole region, called the Decapolis is like 10 smaller cities of sorts, various sized cities, but they're this whole region of Alexandrian Greco-Roman culture, right? It's not Jewish, there's Jews there, but it's a Greek-Roman reality. Now, when Alexander established it, he established it as sort of the epitome of Greek learning, so that you have the gymnasium where you would learn. That's essentially where you're educated as well as you're physically developed, because physique, body, it was everything in that culture. You had the Colosseums where you showed that off, where you fought and you battled, and there was this competitiveness and this aggressiveness and this ambition to show yourself, and anything that was a sign of weakness was quickly eliminated or belittled or perhaps just made into, turned into servitude. You had this massive culture that was centered around that kind of reality, and then you had the worship of gods that were all centered around specific kinds of things, like crafts or hedonism or sex or love or agriculture. You had all of these different gods that sort of centered around very specific kinds of needs. So here's Jesus on one side saying, let's leave this orthodoxy. Let's leave this comfort. Let's leave this reality with which you are so familiar, and let's go over there to that other side that just is so unfamiliar, so alien, in some ways terrifying, and certainly anathema to everything you stand for. Who's with me? And it says that they're willing to go. Now, there's a story that happens in between this one and the story we read, right? And you're familiar with it. It's the calming of the sea happens during the time that they're crossing it. We skipped that and went right to the other side because of my point for the story today. But right there in the middle of the sea, right? Yeah, sure, we'll follow you. And then all of a sudden we have this powerful story where the waters are taking over the boat. The disciples are all screaming and scared to death. And Jesus is looking over going like, I thought you said you wanted to come over here with me. Right? So the whole story is about their inability to sort of see what they're part of, and they begin to mistrust everything and to doubt their own purpose in the world. Now, the second thing you need to know about these stories, because they are written about 50 to 60 years, 40 to 60 years afterwards, is that most scholars begin to see these stories of Jesus not simply as historical moments, but even more profoundly as parables. Jesus' own stories become parables. We're talking 50, 60 years after he was there that we're writing these stories about him. They become parables about the truth he represents. And it's important that you see it that way, because it's only in that way that you can see just how profoundly influential and transformative these stories might be. So I'll give you, for example, so Jesus is going now across the sea, the disciples with him. It says the first thing they see when they arrive is a man rushing towards them, possessed by an evil spirit, who falls to the ground seeing Jesus and says, "Have mercy, don't torture me, Son of the Most High God." We're thinking, well, he means Jesus, Son of God. Son of the Most High God was how they referred to Alexander, how they referred to Caesar, how people in the Greco-Roman reality referred to their ruler as the one chosen to come from on high to establish peace through power and violence and basically squelching everything so that we have order. So we referred to Caesar or we referred to Alexander or the emperor as the Son of the Most High God. So Jesus immediately is being addressed as one who, as a Roman, as an emperor. Then, of course, we have this next thing, which is when Jesus says, "What's your name?" What's the name? Legion. So let's go back a little bit, because what's happening right around 30 to 50 AD is a series of revolts, a series of rebellions are happening in the Decapolis, okay? And then Vespasian sends out a couple of generals with 2,000 soldiers or so, and they roam through that land and destroy everything in their path. They basically take the cities and any of the rebellious ones in there. It says in the story, if you read Josephus, the historian, and you go to this book called Of the War, and it chronicles a history of the wars that happened in the 1st century AD. If you go and you read there, what it says is that they run through, they decimate everything in classic Roman fashion, 1,000, 2,000 soldiers, and they kill 1,000 or more young men, and they take captive all the women and children and enslave them, and then burn the whole thing to the ground, all of the rebellious villages and whatnot, and then reestablish the Roman Empire the way that the Roman Empire does peace through its power. Nobody there to revolt, nobody there to complain. So this has happened sometime around the writing of the gospel or just before. You see what's going on, so that when Jesus says, or when the gospel writer says, Jesus looks at his disciples and says, let's go across the lake, he's not just saying, let's go over and see what's on the other side. He's saying, let's go dance in the middle of death and despair and see what happens. And all the disciples would be going like, no, I'm not going over there. Number one, it's certain suicide. And number two, all of my rabbis would be terribly upset with me. I mean, this is just anathema to who I am as a Jew. I'm not going over there. And they go across, and the first person they meet is a person possessed, and his name is Legion. So here's the question then. Is Mark talking about the person, or is he talking about the culture, the political arena? Is he talking about an individual's relationship with God, or are you talking about despair of a nation, despair of a people, despair of a society? There's this external dimension to our dysfunctional reality. Maybe we find ourselves in a difficult job, or we find ourselves with an unrelenting, angry, or oppressive boss or administration, or we find ourselves in a politically dysfunctional reality, polarized and divisive, or a pattern that seems in our life that it's completely unfixable. There's this external reality that seems overwhelming, but then there's also this internal dimension that it's making you crazy, and you find yourself spiraling out of control sometimes. I mean, we know people like that, right? We listen to the news and we know people that are overwhelmed. We can look on Facebook and we can see this overwhelming sense that we find ourselves in. And so we either address the problem, we cross the lake, we go over and stand in the midst of it and name the truth, or we stay back within the tradition, the circled wagons, and we hide behind it. But if we hide behind it, what happens? I mean, this is what happens essentially in our story. The demoniac represents basically what happens when we repress, when we simply don't name it, when we don't name the dis-ease. It's interesting that blasphemy is deceiving at its root. That means deceiving. It means contradicting the truth of something. And disease, of course, means the same thing. It means basically discomfort, or this inability to face this discomfort, this suffering. So we call it disease, but it's essentially this idea of discomfort and dysfunction. We live with this kind of denial, but if we stay quiet, it overwhelms us. So Jesus does something that he does that you figure out, and if you've done any therapy at all, you realize that the first place you have to get to is what? Is to name the problem. What happens when you don't name the problem? Eventually dysfunction starts to take over in places where you simply feel overwhelmed. So what's happened with the Me Too movement is you've had this sudden naming. What's happened with the Black Lives Matter is you've had this sudden naming. It's always been there. It's as if we were to say 50 years from now, someone were to tell the story of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, and they were going to read that speech and recite that speech, but then forget to mention the hundreds and hundreds of years of slavery, the tension and generations of civil disobedience and oppressiveness. But they're telling this beautiful story about how it's wonderful to have this dream. When we look back at this story, what we don't realize is that Jesus is confronting the way in which we relate to the world. How will we relate to the world? Will we relate to it out of this idea of hiding, of avoiding, or do we relate to it by naming? And sometimes the only way to name the outer external problems in the world are to begin to name our own orientation to it, to begin to name our own discomfort with what's going on. So this lost ticket idea, right? Comedians oftentimes tell jokes because they speak to a deeper truth. What happens if you face your doubts and the answer's not there? How do we live with that kind of mystery? Or as I think what Jesus is saying in this story is that, is there a way to live with this mystery that in fact is larger than having an answer? Is there a way to live in the midst, moment by moment, gesture by gesture, as Mary Oliver says? Is there a way to live into these questions with honesty and vulnerability that begins to address the larger question? Naming it. And then what does Jesus say to the demon-possessed guy, the formerly demon-possessed guy? The guy wants to jump in the boat and go back over to the other side. Let me hang out with you guys. And Jesus says, no, go back to the Decapolis. And what does he say? He says, talk about where you've experienced mercy. You see, until we can get to that place that we honestly can say, I'm here because of you, and you're here because of me, then we're always going to find ourselves falling back on those places that feel safe, especially when we run up against those places that feel demonized, right? When we can begin to realize what Raymond Carver wrote at the end of his life, Raymond Carver, the poet, it's on his gravestone now. And he said, what was it that you wanted in life? Did you finally get it? I did. And what was that? To know that I am beloved and to know that I have loved. That's mercy at the heart of being. And when we get to that place, we begin to dissolve those walls and those blasphemous kinds of rights and wrongs and find connections at the very ground of our being. Amen.
Maybe you can have all the things you've ever dreamed of. Maybe you can drive your Hummer down your gold-plated streets with your dove. Of all the things you want to buy, how do they make you feel inside? You won't find your light in the bargain bin, so you better start your path within and revolutionize your soul. Revolutionize your soul. Revolutionize your soul. What if you had never seen a skyscraper or a superstar? Going up and down in an elevator, not knowing where you are. Of all the things that you have seen, do you even know where you have been? Get up right now and look toward the light. This could be your last chance to ignite.
often say sometimes I probably shouldn't just talk. I should just let the music speak for itself. Such great music out there. Okay, let's all stand together. And as we get ready to go off and maybe go across the street to look at the next 90 or head to the football game, there's this wonderful thing I want you to think about as we leave this place. Leonard Cohen, the great songwriter, had this wonderful song. We've often sang it in here. Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I read this parable this week, this story, and it suddenly occurred to me, the blasphemous thing about that idea is that there's a crack in everything, but that's not how the light gets in. That's how the light gets out. Let's pray. Bless us, Holy One, as we leave this place, that we might, as Mary Oliver would say, that we might pay attention and be amazed and then never forget to talk about it. Amen.